thanks for doing this. I thought that to get started, I would kind of just say quickly how we got together to be having this conversation. And so if you see me glancing over, it's because we have some excellent questions from the CodeBuddies Slack that I'm going to go through too. Basically, this conversation came up. I'm a software engineer like you guys, maybe a little earlier in my career. And I'm faced with an app where I'm designing it from the ground up for the first time. And it's scared the crap out of me because I want to make something nice and scalable and very usable. And I realized I've not had to think about that before. And so thank you both for being good enough to agree to just talk about your experiences. And briefly, I can go ahead and let you talk a little bit about yourselves. So whoever would like to go first.
So I'm a senior software engineer here in Portland, Oregon. When I'm not writing code, I'm usually writing books or blog posts relating to AWS. I've worked on both legacy products, so things that have existed for 10 plus years, and similar situations to what you're in right now. I've worked on Greenfield projects, so built things from the ground up. Learned the hard way of when you're working on Greenfield projects, you can't really blame other people later when the code's not that great, because usually you're the one that wrote the code.
Good point. All right.
Cool. My name is Charlie. I'm a software engineer here in San Francisco, and I work at Shopify. Primarily a backend engineer, also working on a lot of like new marketing tech products. So same thing, building from the ground up, but also being able to contribute to a large existing system as well.
Nice. All right. So maybe before we get into the formal questions, I can ask you guys kind of an intro one, which is, did you start to really think about scale when you were working on more legacy projects? Or I guess I'm curious what really made you have that first aha moment of like, this could be a problem if I don't handle it right.
Yeah, I'll just follow you, Kyle.
When it came to thinking about scale on legacy products, usually the really bumpy roads had already been solved. So somebody else has usually had to experience that pain ahead of time. So in my experience, when thinking about scalability on legacy products, it comes down to thinking about what does the future hold for this product? So what's the business trying to get out of this product 2 years, a year from now? And then forecasting what that looks like to the system in terms of growth and planning for scale that way.
Definitely. I think I could agree with Kyle there in that most projects that, yes, there is a focus on scale, but is it worth waiting for the perfect system to be built from the get-go versus meeting the immediate needs of your customer base or your clientele? So it really is a game of trade-offs. Yes, like the ideal situation is you have a scalable system that meets your immediate goals, but at the same time, that most realistically isn't possible. So what a lot of companies that I've found do is that they build out a system that works and works well, and then they think about scalability as it goes on. It's all about these like improvements as the product grows.
Interesting. All right. Well, nice. I think that's a good starting off point. So if it's okay with you, what I'll do is go through some of the questions that we got just from various people on the CodeBuddies Slack. So one of the first ones was what you mean by Greenfield projects. And I think you actually did explain that well. So maybe a follow-up would be, what's the cutoff point? When does a project go from Greenfield to being the real deal? Because I would think that's maybe where you more have to start thinking about scalability.
When you ship it. So a Greenfield project is very much the project that you're probably on right now, right? You're building something from the ground up. Right now it's an idea. So you're iterating on an idea, but at some point that's going to be made public. You're going to release it to users or internal users, whatever it might be, depending on the system. And so that's when the project's no longer really Greenfield after that, right? Now you're maintaining the system that has real users.
Makes sense. Charlie, did you have anything to add, or pretty good?
No, I think Kyle covers it. Like once you have real users, now you have actual experience on the line. So that's, yeah, I would use the same flag as well.
All right. And I think we may have also just kind of quickly covered, but you can tell me if I got this right. And I guess it actually makes sense. I think you're saying that normally it's a little easier dealing with legacy applications because if there have been growing pains related to scale, you've probably already hit them, which I guess makes sense with the software lifecycle. The highest demand probably isn't going to be like years and years into an application's existence necessarily. But that was, I guess, my takeaway from something that was said earlier. If that wasn't what you kind of meant, you can definitely jump in.
I think you got it. I think when it comes to Greenfield projects, they're tricky to scale initially because it's a guess, right? You're trying to figure out if this is a product that fits users' needs. So you don't entirely know how users are going to use that product until you get it into their hands and start iterating. Versus a legacy product, right? Yeah, you might add a new feature that can diminish the scale, right? So you need to still track it, but it's much, I would say, fine grain.
So that's a great point. And my project is actually kind of funny because it deals with virtualization. And so usually we have one machine kind of wearing multiple hats. So it makes predicting the usage even more interesting on a couple levels. So this is all really good information for me. All right, nice. So this one's kind of interesting. Let's see here. We had one really specific question that was about systems. I don't know if either of you saw that, but it looks like a couple people were interested in this one. And it goes, if you were starting a new project from the beginning, is there any advice you have about the setup from the start? So as an example, would it be a pain to migrate from Heroku, which is known for being good for small projects but expensive at scale, versus a different database, or basically just if that comes into consideration, I guess, when you're picking your systems that you're going to work with?
I can start on this one. I think this really depends at what scale the company is at. So if you're at a large established company, usually you'll have some sort of DevOps team. And picking the tech that your infrastructure team has kind of already built out for you is probably the best bet. If you're at a smaller scale and you're trying to test out a lot of ideas rapidly, then maybe relying on something that like infrastructure as a service or like Heroku, for example, to test out your multiple ideas before really committing to one of them is probably the better route. So it really, that question really depends on where you're trying to go in terms of how big a company is and what sort of audience you're trying to reach.
Right. Okay. So follow up. I know a while back, my company was considering actually utilizing GitLab, and we had heard that they're trying to scale up pretty aggressively and that they were having their own scaling infrastructure issues. So I guess, do you have to try to forecast that when you're looking at vendors and different stuff? It's probably an impossible task, but like, do you try to think of that stuff when you're building complementary architecture that's reliant on third parties?
That's a good point. I think you do if you're already working at scale. So for example, if we're building out a new product at Shopify, like from the gate, once we have that product out, it's going to be used by hundreds of thousands of people from day one. But if you're a startup and you're a completely new company and you're still trying to build your own customer base, maybe you don't need all that forecasting done from the first place. Yes, you can prepare for it, but that's probably not your main concern. Your main concern is probably acquiring more customers. So it's really a difference in focus, I think. It's really nice to have both, but the priorities sort of shifted.
Right. That's a good point. Kyle, don't want to leave you out. Have you ever had to deal with stuff like that on your teams when you're looking at potentially engaging new services that your infrastructure will rely on and worrying about their own capacity to meet demand?
Yeah, I think Charlie really hit the nail on the head with this one. It really comes down to where's the business at in terms of, making money, right? That's software is a means to an end, really. It's a means for a company to make money. Sorry, I have a corgi barking out the window.
Maybe that's a good lead in. We left off talking about microservices a little bit. And so this has been a big question for me. I'm about 2 years in, so until recently, mostly I would just walk into whatever architecture was going on at my past job, which was a established corporate environment. And so I didn't really get to question until recently, like, are there situations where a REST API is or is not most suitable? Are there situations where microservices are going to serve you well in scaling? And so I guess I'm also wondering whose decision that is to make. If you're going into a project and you need to start thinking about architectural decisions, is that something you talk about as a group? Do you kind of weigh it out, or do you have to like work with program managers and kind of agree on something? Or is it more just like seat of your pants, you do something to get a product out the door, and then you inevitably probably have to change stuff down the line? So there's probably not a right answer, but I'd just be curious what both your experiences were.
Sure. So in terms of guiding the project, I personally think it's something that you as an individual can help guide, but in the end, it really is sort of a team decision, because everybody on the team has to sort of follow that architecture to kind of make that work, especially if you're doing a Greenfield project, right? Like you want that sort of structure from the beginning and prevent it from becoming spaghetti code. In terms of, I think you mentioned like picking like a REST API versus a microservices architecture. I think those can also go hand in hand. Like you're not limited to one or the other. A REST API.
Those are just, I don't think they're either or. Those were just two like random, for instances. They're alternatives to the REST API. You know, they're alternatives to microservices. And so I recently was in a meeting where we were talking about all these alternatives, and I realized I didn't have a clear sense of when it would be right to use the REST API versus the alternative. So right. I guess I'm curious about how you guys hash that out.
I see. That definitely comes down to a bit of research, right? So everyone kind of does their research. They say, what are the pros and cons of using this specific implementation? You make sort of a case for it, and then you go from there as a team. I think that comes down to this might just be a culture thing too, like a company culture thing. If you're in a company culture where it's like the technical lead makes all the decisions, that's not the healthiest culture, but that just might be the way it is. A company like the place I work at right now, it's more of a collaborative nature where everyone has their ideas and we all sort of, migrate to what we all consider the best idea. But it really does come with a lot of research in that type of regard. There usually is a blueprint though, like for most of the projects that I've worked on, it's usually build out everything in microservices and then scale out the specific service object into its own app if it becomes big enough. So it's a very easy transition where you have one app built up with a bunch of service objects, but if a service object is doing a lot more lifting, then we just break that out into its own app as its own microservice. So you become a microservice with a lot of services into a service-oriented architecture.
Yeah, that's great information. And I've heard those terms like thrown around a lot, but I guess what I do now is like pseudo microservices, and maybe it will be that when it grows up. So we'll see. But that's an interesting way of looking at it. So it's helpful for me for sure. Kyle, do you have anything on that one?
I think Charlie hit the nail on the head. It's really the best teams I've worked in. It's been a group decision. I've seen the technical lead pattern as well before. And in my experience, that's led to a lot of tension and not everybody believing that's the right architecture, right? And once you get into kind of that situation in a team, it's kind of toxic. So I would strongly encourage that you lean into kind of, discussing things as a group, making those types of decisions as a group, because that architecture is going to succeed and fail based on the team following that architecture.
Awesome. All right. Going down to some more fun ones. So this one's kind of interesting. What kind of metrics do you use, I guess, at current or past jobs when you're defining scalability? Is it usually like your monthly users or your clicks or just, I don't know, what? I don't have like a consumer-facing application, so I'm curious how it works, say, with, I don't know, huge systems or like a Shopify or something. So I'd be curious what kind of metrics you've defined in the past that told you you were going to face a scalability challenge, I guess, or what kind of stuff you look at just to forecast.
Speaking from my experience, I think this very much varies on your system, right? Which is kind of what you're hitting on. From my experience, like I've worked on systems that were responsible for indexing documents, right? And we were processing a terabyte of data every 2 hours or something like that. And so when you're thinking about scale for a system like that, right, you're trying to figure out, well, how much data have I processed in the past 3 months, right? And that was with 50 customers, let's say, right? If sales, right, if the sales team is going to sell to another 100 customers over the next year, right, you can kind of start to draw trend lines of what's that amount of data going to look like if you're a year away from now, right? And so you start to plan for what infrastructure you need in place to support something like that. And so I think a common metric really is the number of users. If you have like a web application, right, you're probably measuring things like page load performance, and you're probably tracking whether or not a feature is being used or not used, right? Because all of those things factor into your scale in the future.
Nice.
Definitely, I resonate with Kyle on that one. Like, it does depend on the system. So I've primarily been a backend engineer that works heavily on APIs. So both like public-facing APIs, but internal APIs as well. And like response time is a huge thing. You never want a slow API. You also want to keep track of database hits, database writes, the performance of your database in general. Like maybe you're missing an index that could severely cut performance. General throughput. So a lot of it definitely is not really application code related, but more how your hardware is keeping up with your application code and making sure that you're optimizing for that.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's all good points. Okay, this one's interesting and kind of related. Somebody asked if micro benchmarks are a waste of time. I don't know that I've heard that term actually.
So micro benchmarks as in like testing a block of code?
I think micro benchmarks, I think I've heard that term before. I think it's usually meant to refer to testing the timing or response time of a single function, right? So instead of thinking about something at a system level, think about something at a function level.
Huh.
I can't honestly say that in my experience I've ever done that level of detail. Like that's getting into the pretty nitty gritty details. I can't say I've ever done that. Trying to think of like what's a good use case for doing that.
Yeah, I can't say I've done the same either. I think like usually there's monitoring solutions. Like Datadog is a popular one. New Relic is another popular one. Those solutions usually bring up severe performance issues in the first place. So I'm not sure if there's a legitimate reason for you as an individual contributor to say, I'm testing, this specific function. It also is really hard to test because your laptop or your personal machine's hardware is very different from a server's hardware. So to me, that makes testing locally somewhat irrelevant because it might test better in a server environment. So yeah, I guess I'm leaning towards they are sort of useless.
The only use case I could possibly see for them is if you're working on embedded systems. So if you're working on something that powers, a car, right? A self-driving car. Maybe then you want something at a micro benchmarking level, right? So, But I think to Charlie's point, if you're in that scenario, right, you're testing on the same hardware every time, right? Because that's where the value is in that type of testing.
I do think it's interesting that I would expect kind of, I guess, that with all the suites out there for testing, that would be one of the first things that would pinpoint. But that is good to know that, they are going to catch it if there's something egregious that otherwise micro benchmarking would have to find. That's good to know. Let's try doing one. I don't know how this one will go. What are some tricks for handling scalability issues once crisis strikes? And I don't know, maybe that kind of lends itself a little bit to the types of scale, like you can scale vertically or horizontally or whatever. I don't know if maybe one's more appropriate if you find yourself in a crazy unexpected crunch or something.
Tricks, shedding functionality. So like if you're in a really bad scale situation, you want to try to shed as much non-critical functionality as you can, I guess. But if your system's not built for that or doesn't account for something like that, like you don't have the fire alarm trigger right in your code that says when this goes off, stop doing this. I think when it comes to scale specifically, I think it really comes down to vertical and horizontal scaling in my experience, right? Sometimes your auto scaling fails, right? So you don't scale out horizontally automatically. So sometimes you need to go in there and do it manually. Sometimes maybe your database server is overloaded and swamped and you need to scale it up vertically. So you need to move to a bigger server. I think those are the two common scenarios I've seen.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I have the same thoughts. It's also a matter of building your application so it can handle like switching off specific parts, like Kyle mentioned, because that kind of goes hand in hand with the whole microservice thing as well. If you design it well enough, you can say, yes, we're kind of syncing, start unloading the ship type of deal by preventing non-critical parts of the app, I guess. Hey kitty, this is mainly like geared towards web apps. I don't know how that would work in an embedded setting or like a specific, like if you're in a car, like what, if you're in a self-driving car, what functionality do you shed at that point, right?
Yeah.
So this is strictly from a web point of view, but yeah, I think those are two good approaches.
Interesting.
I think if you're in the self-driving scenario, right, you have the fire alarm that stops the car.
There we go.
At least I would hope the Teslas of the world are building that.
Yeah.
Or it uses the last bit of juice to just pull you over, I guess. And then no more self-driving. Nice. So let's see which questions we've gotten through a lot. Thank you both so much for doing this. This has been awesome for me so far. All right, so here's another kind of interesting one, and I find it interesting. It seems like a lot of people, their new questions are related to kind of like a doomsday scenario, like if something goes wrong, what do we need to look at? So this one's and I mean, I get it because that was me too. So this one's curious, what are some functional considerations for scalable systems? I guess you kind of answered this though. They said, which would you sacrifice if you hit scalability? It sounds like if you have a microservice architecture, it may be set up to kind of self-regulate that in a sense. And then if not, you basically like throttle your service. You take away things that aren't mission critical to let the app continue to function. So I guess maybe we hit that one. Oh, this one's kind of interesting. It's a little specific, so I'll kind of take it back. They were curious what are some common gotchas when modeling load for testing. I'd also be curious any general advice for modeling load for performance considerations. I've never done that actually.
Interesting. So I know mainly two solutions. One is setting up a sort of redundant system that's not production, and then having production traffic essentially replayed onto the testing environment. So you know that your new changes are going to be able to handle the traffic that you're getting. And the other one is doing manual load testing. So there's like, I forgot I want to say it's like something like something monkey that essentially starts trying to knock out parts of your system. And the whole point of it is to to observe how your system kind of recovers from that. So those are two ways that I can sort of imagine preemptively testing before it actually gets to a production setting.
Yeah, I think if you can capture what your users are doing, and there's gotchas with that, right? Oftentimes you have to scrub data and things like that. You can't have personally identified data inside of your test systems, but if you can capture what your users are doing and replay those sessions as part of your kind of like your performance test harness, it's going to be your best bet in kind of predicting what scale looks like. One thing I'm a big fan of and is the Netflix practice of chaos engineering. I think they've renamed it now. They don't call it chaos engineering anymore. But it's testing in production. So it's that idea that Charlie's talking about where you have your production system running and it's essentially a random bot that's going around and killing your services so that you can see how your real production services react to that scenario. I think it was actually probably Google or somebody that originally started doing this, but Netflix has a ton of open source projects and blog posts that relate to that.
Interesting.
So back to that point, it's actually Chaos Monkey is the thing I was talking about.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's funny. So we're all on the same page in that sense. All right, cool. That kind of goes to another one that's interesting, which is, are there any parts of a system that don't scale? So I guess maybe the thought with that being you focus on what you can get mileage out of in your scaling activities, and then that there are certain things you write off, I guess. Maybe that's the thought behind it.
I guess maybe you could make the case that if you're working in a web application, once the HTML or the single page application has been rendered into the browser, like you're kind of at the mercy of the browser at that point. But I think that's not quite what that question is asking. I think when it comes to scale, especially when it comes to things like the cloud and cloud providers, it's really easy for people to go, oh, well, it's infinitely scalable, right? The reality is nothing is infinitely scalable. And so I think that's where kind of your limits are, is not so much that something can't scale, but that even the things you rely on have limits underneath of them.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think in the most extreme case, nothing scales. If that's our definition, right, then nothing scales. But realistically, 99.99% of all the cases can quote unquote scale given some trade-offs.
Okay, so I think I may be zoning in on the last couple questions. One may have a word that I don't know, so either somebody is punking me or I just don't know it. It is MEMOIZATION. It says, do you do this?
Oh, I see. Memoization.
Memoization, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the concept of temporarily storing the result of something. It's essentially a form of caching, right? But it's like very temporary caching. Yeah. Do I do that? Yes. I think most people do it in some form or another. Some people do it explicitly, and other people use technologies that do it implicitly for them. One thing that you may or may not know is that if you use any popular relational database, these SQL Optimizer actually caches results for you, which means if you're running the same query over and over and over again, and there hasn't been a change registered, it'll actually just return that cached value back to you.
Right.
That would be sort of an example of a memoized result.
Huh. So is it like, as a terminology, is it considered to be shorter term than caching?
That I'm not entirely sure of. I've heard memoizing in the context of Rails and Ruby applications because it's pretty popular. That's a popular term because instance variables are quote unquote memoized instead of cached for whatever reason. But I think, yes, there might be an implication that it's supposed to be shorter.
Huh.
I don't know, Kyle, maybe you have more context around this.
I think usually it's supposed to be shorter. So like when I've seen memoization used, it's usually with recursion. So if you have a function that's calling itself, you can use memoization to store the previous results that you saw earlier in the chain, so that you're not having to go all the way back through. So I think it's a bit splitting hairs, like caching and memoization are the same concept, same idea, except memoization might be at more of a function level versus caching, right? It's kind of at a system level. But I would say caching is a superset of memoization.
Okay. We can end on a possibly fun or terrifying one. What is a crazy experience you've had where a site has been down?
I've been on so you can open up support tickets to AWS when you have issues, right? I've been in a scenario where AWS opened a support ticket with us and called us and told us to stop doing what we were doing. That was at like 2 o'clock in the morning. Essentially, we were hitting AWS S3 very hard because we were using it very much in the wrong way. And so that was probably the craziest experience I've had, having to answer an AWS support call where they're the one calling you. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning because we were working on a production release. And and it was with like an AWS support rep in like Australia too. So
wow. It's a pretty good one.
Yeah, that's a bit terrifying. I think in my case, we were using Sidekick, which is it essentially is a background job processor that uses Redis. But it did, like, one of the behaviors it was creating this log file that essentially logged every event. And in the context of Redis, you're like, oh, there's Redis memory, but you never really think about system memory that it actually lives on. And what we found out was that the logs actually created an overfill of the system, and we were trying to figure out why it was crashing. And there was nothing wrong with Redis's memory, but the system itself was failing. And that took us the longest time to figure out. And when we did figure it out, it wasn't a quick solution because you couldn't SSH into the instance because the instance itself was out of memory. So I was like, okay, what do we do in this case? And it's essentially migrating everything that was in Redis into a fresh instance. But essentially, we were able to reroute. So Sidekick essentially pushes up a job or queues a job into Redis. But essentially, we rerouted all our jobs into the new box, make sure our log file was auto-deleting itself after a while, and essentially had to transfer over to the existing jobs once we were able to truncate the file. Yeah, it was rough. Wouldn't want to do that again.
I think we might have lost Charlie for a second, but that was a pretty crazy one. And I will hopefully have one of my own to share here shortly. So last thing I saw posted from the Slack, I guess, Kyle, I'll ask you this. It sounds like you have a pretty collaborative group, so maybe it's more learning from other people. But yeah, curious just if there were any resources that helped you scale or helped you learn about this stuff.
Yeah, there's some good books out there. I'll drop them in the Slack. Ones related specifically to microservices that are really good to read. And then there's another one called the DevOps Handbook that's really good to read as well, especially when you're thinking about architecting systems and thinking about scale. Taking a DevOps view of that can be really helpful. Those are just some of the resources I use. There's great blog posts out there. There's a lot of great people writing content that have really interesting experiences that we can all learn from. So, yeah.
Nice. Thanks. And then,
sorry, I missed the question. I kind of cut out there.
So last but not least, thank you guys both so much for doing this, and thank Linda for putting this together. This has been awesome. The last parting question comes from Linda, and it was just if there are any resources that helped you learn about this stuff. I was saying to Kyle, it sounds like you both have pretty collaborative teams that you learn a lot from, so that's awesome. But if there's any like books or articles or stuff that you think is helpful.
Who's that guy? Martin Fowler usually has a lot of books about architecture that are good. There's a website called High Scalability that actually dives into known companies' architectures to get a better idea of real, like actual company scaling issues. And just getting a general understanding of what kind of technologies are available will also help with that.
All right, awesome. Well, I will let you go to your evening. Thank you both so much. This has been really interesting, and I have a bunch of Googling I need to go do.
For sure. Thank you for setting this up. It's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.